Technical standards and legislation, as the name suggests, really is looking at what are the relevant standards, technical or otherwise, different regulations and different legislation or law that the organisation needs to comply with. It needs to make sure it understands this because there are different industry requirements. There might be different geographical requirements, different services or product requirements that your organisation produces. Need to keep a register, or it's a good idea to keep a register of applicable standards. And one easy way to do that is to create an additional worksheet in your context of your organisation register if you choose to have one on the back of your ISO system. And then, of course, it's obvious, but you want to make sure we're embedding compliance into the everyday asset management practices, processes, and of course, decision making at every part along the asset lifecycle. It's one thing to have a register of applicable standards, but it's another thing that people are actually aware of them. They understand them, those that are applicable to them, of course, and where they can access them from. So one of the risks obviously is which standards apply to different types of work within the organization. Well, if you've got a well-crafted and designed maybe asset management system or even quality system, that should be embedded into the process or the work instruction at hand. Also making sure from a remedy point of view, provide training or even targeted training and, as you can see there, accessible compliance guides. Because in the world we live in today, we don't just have standards, there is a lot of guidelines that actually help provide information on how to read, interpret, and apply standards around the world. Depending on your industry, there will always be a change in regulation. It might be a subtle change, it might be a dramatic change, it could be a change brought on because there was a significant incident or scenario in a given industry. So the risk here, of course, is sudden changes in legislation or standards create and drive confusion. But what's also important is non-compliance. Depending on your organisation, your context, and the industry you're in, maybe there is a bit of leeway for transitioning to a new regulation. But typically, it will have an effective date, and you need to be able to demonstrate to yourselves and whether it's a regulator or the auditor that you've actually got things in place. So if you could do this by looking at a third-party provider to go and scan for processes and regulatory changes on your behalf. I'm not going to name some of them because I'm in Australia and they differ around the world, but they can communicate changes promptly. And then depending on the size of your organization, you may have a management system manager that can actually put a change request in, opportunity for improvement, before it becomes a non-compliance. Just as important it is to understand what standards we have, what are applicable, and how they work in our organisation as a whole, we also need to look at how they integrate with our daily work. If compliance is seen, as you can see, as a risk here, as a tick in the box exercise rather than part of business as usual, then sometimes people can self-convince themselves that, oh yeah, we are compliant, this is what we're doing about it. But we really do need to look at it from a process point of view, not just a practice point of view, and be able to audit against it if the occasion arose. So again, embedding compliance checks into operational processes, into decision making, but having someone independent of the person of the process actually evaluating that. And that's where it leads to, or back to, how internal audit is such an advantage and should be seen as a test to whether you are compliant with a change to a standard. Now, in many modules throughout this series, we talk about resistance to change. Well, resistance to new standards is an example of that. So the risk here, again, staff resist adopting new practices that are required by either a technical or a legal change, i.e., this doesn't apply to me. I'll wait till the next project. I'll wait till I'm told. No, from a new standard comes out from an effective date, we need to plan and put in place changes to support that. So change impact assessments are a great way to look at this. You might be able to then have a cross-functional team meeting looking at where a standard is applicable. It might be across the whole organisation, part of a function, an entire asset, or maybe part of the asset life cycle. But again, there might be resistance to new standards because people don't like being changed in their own right, but compliance is compliance. Now, when we get onto the topic of, say, legislation and regulation, typically that will impact the entire organisation. But where we get more of a technical standard change, it can often impact one function more than another. I've seen changes of engineering standards or material standards that create tension between the engineering area and supply chain. I've seen changes to an engineering or a regulation, if you like, that has impacted a project, but the project doesn't want to give way to a variation, and that also creates tension. So the risk obviously being different departments interpret them or they apply them differently, inconsistently, but we can get around that by looking at cross-functional compliance. Because at the end of the day, if we need to remain, and we should remain compliant, and there's resources needed to do so or to move one function closer or to satisfy compliance, good leadership says you need to do it. Now, leadership accountability. You might be in an organisation that compliance or regulatory compliance, legislation, etc., it's the law. You'll also find that some organisations, especially in the public sector, can't dissolve or get rid of their accountability. They can discharge their accountability through assurance schemes, but they can't just ignore it. So the risk here is a leader may delegate that compliance responsibility to somebody else. They do not understand why it's required. They may dilute it down so we aren't actually compliant, but we're sort of doing things differently. So we need to make sure that leadership is educated around compliance, the technical standards, the legislation. They understand that accountability and how they own the compliance outcomes, but they also then integrate them back into governance reporting, but also to controls that support governance across the asset lifecycle and throughout the organisation. So from an ISO perspective, in relation to standards or technical standards and legislation, I should say, the first one is understanding the needs and expectations of stakeholders. You might even stretch that into section 4.1, understanding the context of the organisation itself. But 8.1, operational planning and control. So control being a key word there, but also including life cycle management. Because some of the changes or the implementation of a technical standard and legislation, some will be across the entire organisation. Some might be specific to a product or a service, to an asset, or to a respective function in the organisation. So in summary, when we're talking about technical standards and legislation, we need to ensure, okay, that's with evidence, that our organisation is remaining or staying safe, legal, and compliant while managing its assets. So again, all this seems very obvious, but at the same time, we need to also be mindful of not gold plating. If there is a standard that we wish to adopt through regulation, we have to adopt through regulation and legislation, we have to do it. If there's a standard we wish to adopt because we see there's going to be great value in it, that's fine. But we need to be careful that we don't just introduce a whole lot of standards for the sake of it. You'll end up tying the organisation up in knots, you become non-compliant, and people will start to disengage from those that need to be compliant.